Hey there, welcome to Chapter 49, An Introduction to Ecology. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify the levels of ecological study and give an example of a question that you could ask at each of these levels. Explain how species distributions are affected by abiotic, biotic, and historical factors. Explain the main factors that establish climate patterns. Describe the factors that affect species variation and number within terrestrial ecosystems. Describe the factors that affect species variation and number within aquatic ecosystems. All right, so this unit of the course, we're talking about ecology. So ecology is defined as the study of how organisms interact with their environment. So the main goal of ecology is to be able to understand the distribution and abundance of organisms, meaning where are they on Earth? Why are they all here? Why aren't they over there? Why are there a lot of them here? Why are there a few of them over there? So we often have to kind of pull in other areas of biology to be able to address ecological questions. And one of the main things that ecologists are doing right now is trying to figure out how humans are impacting the environment, because this is clearly something we can do something about. Okay, so let me define the 5 basic levels of ecological study that ecologists work on. The first is organismal ecology, and so this is the smallest. This studies adaptations that allow individual organisms to live in a particular area, okay? So, what allows this animal to live under the sea versus this animal that lives in a very cold environment, right? It also studies how individuals interact with their physical surroundings and other organisms in their habitat. All right, one level up from that is population ecology. So we've talked about a population before when we were talking about evolution by natural selection, but let's redefine. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area at the same time, okay? So a population is smaller than a species, right? A species is made up of a bunch of little populations, just because all of the individuals in a population, they can mate with each other, but they may not be able to reach individuals in other populations. And if populations are separated for very, very long periods of time with no gene flow, they may become new species. All right, so a population ecology question might be, how do numbers of individuals in a population change over time? Okay, why do we have more individuals before and fewer after? All right, the third level is community ecology. And so a biological community refers to the species that interact with one another within a particular area. So again, a community is multiple different species that have interactions. So this area studies interactions between species and often will ask questions like, how do the different groups of species respond to disturbances like fires, floods, and other things? The fourth level is ecosystem ecology. So an ecosystem is all of the organisms in a particular area, right, which is a community, plus the non-living or abiotic components. So the ecosystem includes the living stuff that's there, but also abiotic components like humidity, temperature, the pH of the soil, things like that. So a question you might ask in ecosystem ecology is, how do nutrients and energy move among organisms and between atmosphere and soil or water? And then the fifth level is global ecology. And so this is the study of the biosphere. The biosphere is basically the zone that surrounds the Earth where all life exists. And we ask questions like, how do humans impact the entire biosphere of the Earth? So conservation biology comes up quite a bit. Also, this is defined as the effort to study, preserve, and restore threatened populations, communities, and ecosystems. And when people study conservation biology, they will incorporate all 5 levels of ecological study and use them to be able to address questions in conservation biology. All right, so y'all, you want to put these in order? Which one is the largest?
Oh, it's global.
All right. What's smaller than that?
Oh, I think it's ecosystem because that has like the community and also the abiotic.
Okay. So smaller than that?
Community.
All right. Smaller than that? Population. Yeah. And what's the smallest one?
Organism.
Okay. So one question that people ask in an ecological context is, what determines the distribution and abundance of organisms? And there's a field of study called biogeography, which just studies how organisms are distributed geographically, why here and not there, okay? And it could be looking at species that are in the here and now or fossils of species. So we all can kind of appreciate that interactions with the environment are going to affect where you can live, right? So the environment, when we talk about environment, even though commonly when we say the word environment, we're thinking of things that are abiotic, like temperature, humidity, or something like that. In ecology, environment doesn't just refer to these abiotic factors, but also biotic factors. So things like what predators are there, what parasites are there, right? What pathogens are there. So these kinds of things, not only temperature and humidity, but also parasites, pathogens, competitors, other things like that are going to determine where a particular species can live. So there is nothing that can live in all the places of Earth, right? And we have a name for the suite of conditions a species can tolerate, and that is called a niche, okay? So a niche is just the range of all possible places that particular species can live in. So for example, if we look at an Arctic microbe, it has a tolerance for cold weather. It actually can't really live in hot weather. It can only live between 20 and minus 20 degrees Celsius. Okay, so it's cold adapted. You can also see that it can tolerate a quite wide range of temperatures that might be experienced in the Arctic as things thaw and then refreeze. And then here's another kind of an organism, a hot springs microbe. So that lives at extremely hot temperatures between, 50 and 80 degrees Celsius. It actually has a much smaller range of temperatures it can live at. So it has a narrower tolerance. So you can see its peak is, narrower in this direction. And it's higher because it's narrower. This one is a broader peak. Okay. So these both represent the niches of these two different species. All right, so we know that the living or biotic factors can cause animals to be able to live somewhere or not live somewhere. So, for example, if you look here, the red represents the distribution of the tsetse fly. So this is a fly that causes disease to cattle. And the blue represents the distribution of cattle. So you can see that farmers who live in this red zone, very few of them own cattle. You can see some overlapping areas here in purple. But for the most part, the cattle live where the fly doesn't live and don't live where the fly does live, right? So in this case, the fly is limiting the distribution of the cattle. So it might not just be something that causes disease like a tsetse fly. It could also be a competitor, or it could be something like a reproductive requirement. So maybe it's like a damselfly that has to lay its eggs in little pools of water inside rotting logs and there's no logs. It could be parasites that are there or anything really that can interact with a species to cause it to be able to live somewhere but not be able to live in a different place. All right, another factor that dictates where you find things on Earth has to do with the historical kind of relationship. So we know that the history of the Earth has affected the dispersal of species. So by dispersal, we mean the movement of an individual from where it was born to where it will live and breed as an adult. So we know that the movement of the continents has affected the ability of different groups to be able to disperse. So this is kind of the history of the Earth here, going from 400. I don't know what the end is here. 400 million years ago to the present, okay? So around 300 million years ago, around here, there was a supercontinent called Laurentia that was to the north, over here, and another supercontinent called Gondwana to the south. So this one had a mild climate. Well, actually, both of them had fairly mild climate. By 220 million years ago, the two had kind of merged together to form the supercontinent Pangaea, and the climate was pretty warm at that point. 120 million years ago, Pangaea broke apart, and the climate was mild to temperate. And then 3 million years ago, North and South America were joined by a land bridge, but there was worldwide glaciation. So we have a combination of different routes by which organisms can move from one continent to another continent, right? And different ranges of temperatures that organisms could either survive or not survive. Oh yeah, I should also point out that it's important not to just look at the continents, which we have a tendency to do because we're, land animals, but also think about the way that the continents and the movement of the continents affects marine species. So, for example, whenever you have a land bridge that goes across from one continent to another, that actually prevents, kind of species in the ocean from going from one side to the other side. Okay. All right. We're going to talk about, at this point, a variety of different kinds of kind of phenomena that we have found that are major trends in ecology. But to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about the Wallace line, because this also relates to a barrier to dispersal. And so, Wallace, the dude who also helped to kind of make the theory of evolution by natural selection a thing, had made an observation when he was traveling that if you looked at the species of plants and animals that were on opposite sides of the Malay archipelago, they were very, very different. So even if you look at islands like Borneo and Sumatra that are pretty far away from mainland Asia, they all had species that you would find in mainland Asia. But if you go on the other side of this this line, which is called the Wallace line, to these islands over here, you tend to find species that you also find on Australia. Okay? And what we now know is that there's actually a deep ocean trench through here. And this deep ocean trench has separated landforms and species so that they can't cross. So you're not able to get on a little raft and go across this way like you would between the islands on either side of the trench. It should be pointed out at this point that this is a kind of a geographical feature that has to do with the geology, but there are a lot of patterns that are caused by humans. So, for example, humans will influence species distributions by where they hunt and where they farm. Also, people will have a tendency to physically transport plants, birds, insects, and other species to new places. So it could be on purpose, right? It could be a species that somebody wants to kind of grow in their own land, that they pick up from far away, or it could be on an accident. So maybe they accidentally get a hitchhiker on some fruit or something that they've purchased. So if you have an exotic species, which is one that's not native, introduced to a new area, sometimes nothing happens. That species can't survive and it dies. But sometimes that new species will spread rapidly, and in doing so, will start to eliminate native species. So if a species gets to the point where it's introduced and then it spreads to the point where it's harming natives, it's called an invasive species. So here's some examples here. So this is in North America. If you go further south, you can see kudzu, which is a vine. And it'll basically grow over all of the other plants and kind of choke them so that they don't get enough light. We have this one here. This is a zebra mussel. So it's a little tiny bivalve. And so this is just somebody showing what a zebra mussel incrustation looks like. And so these kind of they travel from place to place in ships. So if you think about it, if a ship is carrying a whole lot of cargo, right, from one place to another place, when it has the cargo, the ship is fairly low in the water, right? But once it unloads its cargo, then the ship is kind of floating too high in the water and it makes it unstable. So the ship will take on water on purpose. It'll store water and use that, to be able to get back to its original port. And then when it gets there and it has to reload with more cargo, it'll spill out the water, right? This is one way in which the zebra mussel has traveled all over the world. So it has become an invasive species here, and it will block up pipes and stuff like that and cause an economic problem for people, as well as affecting native life. All right. We often hear about climate and weather as if they're the same thing, but they are not. So when you hear the word climate, you should think of a prevailing long-term weather condition found in an area, okay? So, we talk about the climate of a particular region. We're not looking at today versus yesterday. We're looking over long, long periods of time, okay? When we're talking about weather, we're thinking about specific short-term atmospheric conditions of things like temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. So when you go check your phone to figure out, what you should wear today, you're looking at weather. Climate is a longer-term pattern, so if you went and looked at climate, I guess it would give you the range of things you might wear, but probably wouldn't be that helpful for knowing what clothes to wear.
That's just ridiculous. If you had fur, you wouldn't have to worry about that.
Well, don't you shed your fur every year?
I do shed my fur every year.
Well, how do you know when to do that?
I don't, it just happens.
Right, it's kind of related to climatic cues, right?
I guess.
Okay. So this is the second in the series of questions we're going to kind of address about the world in general. One question people often ask is, why are the tropics warm and why are the poles of the Earth cold? And so one thing to think about is that if you're on the equator and the sun is directly overhead, then when the sun kind of shines on the equator, you get more rays per unit area, okay? If you are at 30 degrees north, for example, sun is coming in at an oblique angle, and so the same rays of sun are being spread over a wider area, right? So you get less sunlight per unit area, and if you go even further north, the same waves, the same kind of photons, are being spread over an even wider area, okay? And so you get even less sunlight per unit area. Okay, so, yep. People often ask why the tropics are wet. This is a little bit more complicated, but not too complicated. We know that if you look at the Earth, the areas of the Earth that are at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south in latitude, so here and here, are the driest on Earth, and those are where the deserts tend to be. Okay, the equator is fairly wet, right? But then 30 degrees north and south are dry. And so this is caused by a major cycle in global air circulation called a Hadley cell. And so let's work our way through it. All right, so remember how we talked about at the equator, you get the most sunlight per unit area, right? So at the equator, the sun is shining directly and the land gets heated up and the air, above that land gets heated up, and then the air will rise, right? It expands because the molecules in the air are, spread more widely apart because it is hot, and hot molecules move, kind of faster, and so the air will expand. When it expands, it rises. Okay. Warm air can hold a lot of moisture, and that is because the warm water molecules tend to stay in vapor form and don't tend to turn into a liquid form. Okay. Okay, so now you have this warm, wet air rising. And as it rises, the atmosphere around it is cooler, right? So the air loses heat into the atmosphere and it cools as it goes up. It will also expand into the larger volume of the upper atmosphere, so that causes it to be less dense and also to become cooler. Okay, then cooler air has less of a capacity to hold on to water because the water starts to condense into liquid form. And when the water condenses in liquid form, so the water is being forced up this way. The air is being forced up this way, okay? And so as it cools, it's starting to try and come back down, but there's air coming up this way. So when it starts to come back down, it'll come back down away from the equator, okay? The water will condense, and then high levels of precipitation will occur here. And the more the air is heated at the equator, it kind of pushes the older, cooler air out of the way, and the cooler air gets pushed north and south towards the poles. And so then the air ends up over here. And as the air mass cools, its density will begin to increase, and so it gets lower and lower, right? So the hotter air rises and the colder air sinks. So the air starts to sink down over here, 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. And as it sinks, it starts to absorb solar radiation from the Earth's surface and warms up. And as it warms up, it has more capacity to hold water. And then the warm air will return to the surface, and it just ends up with very little precipitation by the time it gets down to the bottom, so the air isn't holding on to very much water up here. It could hold on to water by the time it gets down to the bottom, but it tends to be very dry there. So, so the air will absorb moisture, and then that'll get transmitted this way to the equator, and then it'll go back up again over here. So you basically have a cell in which air is moving this way, right? So it's hot, it is cooling and losing moisture, going down here, where it's very cold and has lost all of its moisture, and then it'll start to heat up and pick up more moisture as it goes this way, etc. Same over here. There's actually also a couple of more cells that are doing something similar. So you have a mid-latitude cell that is happening between the 30-degree north and 60-degree north like this, and then you have a third polar cell up at the top. And you have the same three cells here, so you have another mid-latitude cell. So let's see, that one goes this way. And then, let's see, then this one goes this way as well. Okay. All right. I should also point out, so there are, like I just said, there's 3 circulation cells in each hemisphere. And we've drawn them like they go straight up and down, right? But they actually don't go quite straight up and down. Because of the spin of the Earth, the air in each cell doesn't move like straight north-south, and instead it goes at an angle. And this is caused by the Coriolis effect. So it causes air within a cell to be deflected into a clockwise pattern around the globe in the northern hemisphere, and also a counterclockwise way in the southern hemisphere. And so you can kind of see, I mean, it's hard to see what's going on with cells, but you can see if you look at the trade winds, it causes the wind directions to go in different directions in the northern and the southern hemisphere. Also, water currents as well. All right, another question. So why do we have seasons, right? So by seasons, we mean regular annual fluctuations in temperature, precipitation, or both. So if we look at the Earth here, where are we? In June, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, right? So here's the northern hemisphere, so it's tilted towards the sun. So it faces the sun most directly and gets more solar radiation per unit area. Okay. If you look over here in the if you look in the southern hemisphere in June, you can see they're facing away from the sun, so they actually get less solar radiation per unit area, like over here, for example. So this is why June is summer in the northern hemisphere, but it is winter in the southern hemisphere. All right, by December, the southern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun over here, and it faces the sun most directly. So this is when you have summer on the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, you have less light per unit area coming in. I guess over here as well. And so then you have the coldest part of the year. In March and September, you have the equator facing the sun most directly, so the tropics are going to receive the most solar radiation. You kind of get a transition between seasons. All right, so the reason why you have seasonality is entirely due to the fact that the Earth has a tilt on its axis, so it doesn't move straight up and down. Instead, it's tilted at 23.5 degrees. So if we didn't have this tilt, there would be no seasons. It would always, each area would get more or less light depending on how close or far it was from the equator, all the time the same. All right, so what do you guys think would happen to the seasons if the Earth were tilted 35 degrees off its orbital plane instead of the usual 23.5 degrees?
I think we would all spin off into space.
I don't think so. I don't think that affects anything having to do with spinning off into space.
Okay, good.
All right, so which do you think it is? I think that you'd have like more severe seasons. Yeah, you'd probably have more severe seasons, right? Would it affect the length of the season? No, because it still takes the same amount of time for the Earth to go around the sun. Yeah, it still takes about the same amount of time. So instead, we would just have even more sun per unit area on whichever part of the Earth happened to be facing the sun at that time of year. All right, so mountains and oceans can also have an effect on climate. So you get something that we call a rain shadow caused by mountains. So what you have is, so you have air that's blowing over the Pacific Ocean, so it's picking up moisture from the Pacific Ocean, and it will kind of blow up over the mountains. As it goes up the mountain range, it's kind of getting higher and higher, and as the air goes higher and higher, it kind of cools, and the cool air is unable to hold on to the moisture. So basically it'll come out. The moisture will come out of the air as rain, and it'll rain all the way up and down the side of the mountain. And then once the air gets over the top of the mountain, it basically has lost all of its moisture. So the air that kind of blows down the other side of the mountain is very dry. So this is a rain shadow. You get this kind of dry air. And so a lot of the major deserts are formed this way. So the Great Basin Desert, Atacama, and Asia's Tibetan Plateau are all major deserts that are the result of a rain shadow. All right, you can see effects of oceans on climate as well. And you learned about in 1113 that water has a very high specific heat, meaning a very high capacity to store energy. And so you all know from, if you've ever been to the beach, water tends to absorb atmospheric heat in the summer and releases it in the winter. So if you go to the beach, if it's very hot outside, it's not as hot at the beach because the water's absorbing a lot of the heat, right? And not changing much in temperature as it absorbs it. And then in the winter, it tends to be a little bit less cold near the water than far away from the water because the water is still holding on to some of the heat that it acquired in the summer and is releasing it slowly. So it takes a lot to make water change in temperature, okay? All right, and so we know that there are these ocean gyres, or these big current cycles that bring warm water to colder latitudes and vice versa. So a couple of them kind of do some kind of weird things that cause differences in temperature. So for example, if you go up into the Newfoundland area of Canada here, it is so cold, right? And if you go across the same latitude towards the UK or Great Britain, it is not cold at all. And why is this happening? Well, there seems to be a gyre, a big kind of circular ocean current that is kind of going around here. In the northern hemisphere, gyres go in a clockwise way because of the Coriolis effect, and a counterclockwise way in the southern hemisphere. And for whatever reason, you have a gyre here that's going past Africa and then picking up warm water as it goes past South America. And the warm water is completely bypassing Newfoundland and then being kind of shunted over to the UK. And so for that reason, very cold in Newfoundland, but not very cold in Great Britain. All right, so match the question to the answer. Okay, so why are the tropics so wet and the areas 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south in latitude so dry?
Oh, I remember that one. That one was caused by them circulation cells.
Yeah, do you remember the name of the particular circulation cell that goes between the equator and 30 degrees north and then between the equator and 30 degrees south?
Yeah, it's Hadley cells.
Yeah, it's a Hadley cell, right. So why does the west coast of Europe have mild weather?
That's them ocean gyres. Wow.
Yeah, I thought you hated the water.
I kind of hate the water, but I'd like to see that.
Okay. So why are the tropics warm and the poles cold?
That's just because of the angle of sunlight hitting the earth. That's nothing special.
Okay.
Like when I go sit next to the window to get as much light as possible.
I don't even know why you do that. It's not cold in here.
I need as much light as possible.
Okay. All right, Kat. So why do air and water deflect in a clockwise path in the northern hemisphere and a counterclockwise path in the southern hemisphere?
Did you say counterclockwise? Because that would be really wrong.
No, I said counterclockwise.
Okay, fine. That's a Coriolis effect.
Yeah, that's a Coriolis effect. That's why people say, like, if you flush the toilet in the southern hemisphere, the water will go around the other way. I don't think that's actually true. Toilet's really small. It's probably more based on, like, the particulars of how the toilet's built and if it's on an angle. Anyway, why is there seasonality in weather? It's because of the tilt of the Earth. Yeah, the tilt of the Earth. What caused the Wallace Line separating Asian from Australian species?
That was that ocean trench.
Yep. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to have a survey of different kinds of biomes on Earth. Okay, so a biome is a region characterized by distinct abiotic characteristics and also by dominant vegetation types that tend to be there. So the kind of biome that you're going to find in any terrestrial area is going to depend mostly on the climate, okay? On the temperature, the moisture, the sunlight, and the wind. And so we know that temperature defines the niche, right, or the range of most species that can only live in particular temperature ranges. Everything requires some kind of a moisture for life, and all organisms are constantly losing water into the atmosphere, either by evaporation or transpiration. If something is a photosynthesizer, it needs sunlight for photosynthesis, so sunlight matters. And we also know that the amount of wind that an area receives is going to exacerbate the effect of temperature or moisture. Okay? So this is a map.
Wait a minute.
What?
What does exacerbate mean?
It means to make worse. Yeah, it means to make worse. Okay? So this is just a map of different kinds of biomes. So in this class, we are basically covering these 6 major biomes, okay, which you can see here by color.
I can't see color.
Well, I'll just tell you, the Arctic one is the most north, then the boreal, and then the temperate grasslands, subtropical forest, and then the tropical wet forest. But we also have a variety of other more specific kinds of terrestrial biomes that we can also see here. So net primary productivity is the total amount of biomass generated by the carbon that is fixed per year minus the amount of fixed carbon oxidized during cellular respiration. Okay, so we'll get into that more in a minute. When we're talking about biomass, we mean just the total mass of organisms. And so usually we're referring to the mass of primary producers like plants or algae or something like that, okay? So it's how much algae is generated is what we're referring to in terms of, or plant is what we're referring to when we're talking about biomass. And the reason we care about MPP is it represents the organic matter that's available as food to other organisms. Okay, so it's what the carbon gets used for after it is kind of used by the plants for cellular respiration to be able to make more plant, okay? And so if you're in a terrestrial environment, often we will just estimate NPP by measuring above ground biomass rather than dealing with the roots because the roots are often inaccessible to be able to be used by most other animals. Okay, so let's start with our first biome, first terrestrial biome. Tropical wet forests. And so these are also known as tropical rainforests, and they tend to occur around the equator. There is almost no seasonal variation in temperature. So here's the average temperature. It's well above freezing, of course, and it doesn't vary much at all. This is the amount of precipitation, okay? And so even the driest month in a tropical wet forest has more rain than many deserts have in an entire year. It's a lot of water. And so because there is good growing condition, not just part of the year, but all year, you tend to have high species diversity. You also get structural diversity in plant sizes and growth forms, meaning you have big tall trees, you have little skinny vines, you have little things on, that are mid-height, you have grassy things, you have, bushy things, okay? So much diversity. The plants tend to have broad leaves and are evergreen. Okay, so they don't ever drop their leaves because they never need to. And because of this diversity of plant growth forms, there's lots and lots of places for animals to be able to live. Okay, so that is tropical wet forests. Subtropical forests are the subtropical deserts are what you tend to find at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. And so the average monthly temperatures are high, but there's more variation than in the tropical wet climates. So it doesn't get below freezing, but it can get quite cold. You have very low precipitation, of course. That's what kind of makes it a desert. So if you look over here, very low precipitation. And species there tend to adapt to these extreme temperatures and aridity, meaning dryness, because they, by being able to grow at a very slow rate year-round, is one of the two options. So some of them will just grow a little tiny bit at a time, but they're growing all the time. Other ones will basically only appear during a rainfall episode. It'll rain, it'll grow quickly, put up flowers, the flowers will bloom, and then it'll die off again until it rains again. And as we saw in our lab on angiosperm diversity, plants like cacti have modifications to reduce water that is lost, including not having leaves or having the leaves modified into spines. All right, next we have the temperate grasslands. And so this is what we would call, another name for what we call our prairie in the United States. In Eurasia, this is called the steppe area. And you have a moderate seasonal temperature and rainfall. Moderate in that it only falls below freezing a little bit. And you get a little bit of rain all the time, but a lot more rain sometimes a year. Because of the variation in temperature, plants can only really grow in the spring, summer, and fall. They can't really grow in the winter because it is too dry and it is too cold. So you tend to have lower productivity, meaning the amount of biomass that's made by plants, lower productivity than forest communities, but the soil is often very fertile and you can grow a lot of things there. You tend to find that grasses are the dominant life forms in prairie, either because there's not quite enough moisture to be able to grow larger trees, or because you tend to have regular fires. There's a fire regime where fires tend to burn through the prairie at regular intervals, and as a result, you never are able to get trees that grow to a big enough level that they can start reproducing. So the conditions are slightly too hot and too dry to support forests. All right, next we have temperate forests, and so you can see that the average temperatures are not that different from the prairies. However, you can see that you have more water, right? And so the temperatures are moderate and moderately variable. You can't grow year-round, so there is part of the year in which plants just stop growing. And the precipitation compared to the grasslands is moderately high and relatively constant throughout the year, and so there's enough water to be able to support growing trees. And so the dominant form that you find in a temperate forest are deciduous trees, and these trees will drop their leaves in the winter. You also find evergreen trees like, pines and stuff, and those are there year-round. All right, so the next biome is the boreal forest. Another name for a boreal forest is a taiga. They are subarctic, meaning just a little bit, south of the Arctic Circle. And if you go there, you'd find that they have all of these cold-tolerant conifers, so these kind of cone trees that are specially adapted to live in such a cold place. So the average temperature is mostly below freezing and then just gets above freezing for a little bit of the year. The productivity is very low, right? However, if you were to measure the above-ground biomass, you'd find that it was very high because these slow-growing trees live for a really long time, and so there's lots and lots of these trees, right? If you were to cut them down, it would take them an extremely long time to come back because they're such slow growers. Boreal forests have very cold winters and short, cool summers, and so the temperature variation you can see is much more extreme from one season to the next, and the annual precipitation is very low. So on the one hand, the fact that it's so cold makes it so that even though they don't get a lot of moisture, they don't get very much evaporation either. So the plants tend not to be limited by the moisture so much as they're limited by the cold. So you end up with a fairly low density, but lots of trees. All right, then finally, the last terrestrial biome we're going to talk about is the Arctic tundra. So that is in the Arctic region of the northern hemisphere. So the soils are permafrost, meaning that they are permanently frozen. So you can see here, temperature is almost always below freezing with only a little period of time above freezing. If you look around, you would find mostly small woody shrubs, lichens, and herbaceous plants with fairly low plant species diversity because there aren't that many things that can live there, and low productivity, right, because there's such a short growing season, and low above ground biomass. So the growing season is only 10 to 12 weeks, and then the rest of the year it's below freezing. So you have very low temperatures, and high variation in temperature and very low annual precipitation. All right, name all 6 terrestrial biomes.
Arctic tundra.
Yeah, what else?
Boreal forest.
Yeah. Tropical rainforest. Yeah.
Temperate rainforest.
Yeah. I lost track of how many we have. Which ones didn't we do?
Did you do the taiga?
Yeah, we did the boreal forest. Which one did we miss?
Deserts.
Yeah, you missed deserts. Did we do them all?
No, I think we missed one.
We did Arctic boreal forests. We did temperate forest. We did tropical forest. We did desert. What else did we miss? Wow. Well, we're going to have to go back and look and find out what we missed. Okay, hang on. We got tundra. We got boreal forests. Got temperate forests. Oh, we forgot the temperate grasslands. Oh, shame on us. Okay. Oops. All right, which one is the coldest?
It's the taiga.
Yeah. Which one is the warmest?
It's probably the tropical rainforest or the desert.
Which one's the wettest?
Tropical rainforest.
Yeah, which one's the driest?
Desert.
So, we know that more than 75% of the part of the Earth that doesn't have ice on it has evidence of direct alteration by humans. So if you look at this map here, the red areas represent cities and suburbs, which you can see go all over the place. Wildlands are the white areas. So wildlands only represent 11% of terrestrial net primary productivity. And the things that we do to the landscape also affect climate. So when we deforest, that directly reduces the cloud cover and the rainfall, which indirectly increases the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. All right, so why is it that net primary productivity is higher in temperate forests than in boreal forests? Do you remember which is which?
The temperate forests are the ones kind of near here.
Yeah. And what's the boreal forest?
Those are the ones that are really far north, right below the Arctic Circle.
Yeah. All right. So why is the net primary productivity higher in the temperate forests than in boreal forests? Should I read some choices?
Yeah.
All right, because the species diversity is higher in temperate forests.
I mean, that statement is true.
The statement is true. We don't know if that's why net primary productivity is higher. Is it because there's more precipitation in temperate forests?
Oh yeah, that could be.
Because boreal forests do not support year-round photosynthesis?
Well, I mean, they don't, but you don't get year-round photosynthesis in temperate forests either.
Yeah. Is it because it's colder in boreal forests?
It is colder in boreal forests.
Yeah, so that probably affects things. Is it because it's both warmer and wetter in temperate forests than in boreal forests?
Oh yeah, that has all the things.
Yep, that's the answer. It is both warmer and wetter in the temperate forests than in the boreal forests. All right, so we are very eager to know how global climate change is going to affect these terrestrial biomes, and so people have done experimental tests of climate change by taking small plots of the Arctic tundra and putting little kind of greenhouses on the top of them to determine what the effect of raising the temperature a little bit would be on primary producers. And your book has more detail about it, but just for the sake of time, I'll just describe it very briefly. They found that the species diversity on the tundra decreases, and compared to the control plots, you tended to get more grasses and shrubs, but less mosses and lichens. And so the result seems to support information that we get not from these tent experiments, but instead using mathematical modeling simulations that say that the Arctic tundra environment may be giving way to a boreal forest. So as the Arctic tundra becomes warmer, it may become, in terms of the kinds of things that can live there, more like a boreal forest. And so you think, well, that may not be bad, right? But that pattern of just transitioning from one biome to another biome is not likely to occur the same way in all areas of the Earth. So for example, if we have decreased rainfall in the Amazon, that could cause a rapid shift from rainforest to grassland, right? And then you would end up with a feedback loop where you had less rain and more frequent fires, and eventually you would end up with a stable grassland that had a much less biodiversity than you would actually have right now in the rainforest. So we would lose a lot in this transition. We would also expect things wouldn't just change from one biome to the next, but instead to get a lot more variation in things like storm events and drought. And so this would make it harder for diverse species to be able to live in these climates. All right, we're going to move now to talk a little bit about aquatic biomes. Okay, so we're moving from terrestrial to aquatic. And there are four major factors that we can kind of use to define aquatic biomes. The first one is salinity. So that's the proportion of solutes dissolved in water, right? The second characteristic is water flow. And so lots of organisms have adaptations for fast-flowing water or violent waves. So remember we talked about the intertidal zone and all the little creatures that are adapted to being able to survive in that environment. We also know that flow rate, meaning how much water passes a particular area per unit time, can also determine how much oxygen is available. So if the water is very slow and sluggish, there may not be very much oxygen exchange, but if it's a fast-running river, there may be lots of oxygen exchange. The depth of the water matters too. It can affect the amount of light and also the heat of the water and nutrient availability. So I'm going to talk about, I think we've probably given you all the information about 1 and 2 that you need, but we're going to go into more detail about 3 and 4. All right, so water absorbs light and scatters it, and so the light available to organisms, plants, and animals is going to change as you get deeper and deeper under the water. When we talk about turbidity, we mean the cloudiness of the water, and so the turbidity of the water is going to determine how deep into the water light can go. And obviously, light affects productivity, right? So if something can access light, it can photosynthesize. So we can categorize ocean and lake habitats based on the depth of the water that they live in and how much sunlight is available to them. So in an ocean habitat, we define 6 different zones. The intertidal zone, you can see, is this little strip here. So that is the area that is submerged, meaning underwater, at high tide and then exposed at low tide. The zone after the intertidal zone, before the continental shelf, is the neritic zone. And so it's kind of gently sloping, and it's underwater all the time. And the neritic zone would be where you would find something like a coral reef. Beyond that, beyond the continental shelf, is the oceanic zone. Okay? So that is where the deep water is. All right, we also define things by whether they're on the top or the bottom of the water. So if something is benthic, that's the bottom of the ocean. So you can have like a benthic zone here, in the intertidal zone. You can have a benthic part of the neritic zone or a benthic part of the oceanic zone. And then the photic zone is this kind of little layer on the top that sunlight can reach. So you have, actually all the intertidal zone is photic, and most of the neritic zone is photic, but then in the oceanic zone, you only have this little bit of the oceanic zone that's photic, and then below that, no sunlight can go. So the areas that do not receive sunlight are called the aphotic zone. I should also point out that red wavelengths of light are not available underwater. This is just what gets filtered out in terms of light as it passes through water. And remember, we talked about that lots of organisms grow very well using red light, but unfortunately, they don't have access to it if they're underwater. All right, so which of these is which? Which is the intertidal zone?
Submerged at high tide and exposed at low tide.
All right, what's the aphotic zone?
That's the areas that don't receive sunlight.
All right, what's the benthic zone? The bottom. Yeah. Oceanic zone.
That's a deep water region beyond the continental shelf.
All right, what's the neritic zone?
It's that part on the continental shelf.
Yeah, what's the photic zone?
I can't find it, but it's the one where the sun is.
Yeah, sunlight region.
Yeah, sunlight region.
Okay. So which marine zone would have the lowest rates of primary productivity or photosynthesis?
The dark part.
Okay, so what's that one called?
Aphotic.
Aphotic. All right, so lakes are smaller than the ocean, obviously. So we have given some names that are different to the zones in a lake. Okay, so instead of there being an intertidal zone, there's not really tides, right? So we just call this the littoral zone over here. So it just means a little seashore area, where you kind of have the water kind of lapping. You might also find flowering plants that are rooted here that kind of grow up through the water. And then beyond that, you have the limnetic zone. And so this is the part that's offshore and, basically comprises water that receives enough light to support photosynthesis over here in the limnetic zone. And then you would just define the photic, aphotic, and benthic zones the same way that you would define those in the ocean. All right, so let's think about nutrients in water, okay? So obviously everything needs nutrients, okay? And if you have primary producers and they can't get nutrients, then they can't live, right? So the issue that you have is in the photic zone of the ocean, you get all the sun you want, right? But less nutrients, because every time something dies or, sheds nutrients, it just rains down. You can see like this. It just rains down to the bottom, okay? So on the bottom, lots of nutrients, no light. On the top, lots of light, no nutrients, okay? So anything that dies will drift down to the benthic zone, and their nutrients are basically lost from the photic zone. And so things that are in the benthic zone will survive by eating all the nutrients that drift down from the photic zone. So being a bottom feeder doesn't sound that bad, does it?
I'll eat things that fall on the ground.
Yes, you do, dog. All right, so then the question is, well, the things in the photic zone need nutrients, right? Or they wouldn't be able to keep photosynthesizing. So how do they get them? And so I'm going to talk about 3 mechanisms by which stuff, photosynthesizers in the photic zone get nutrients. I'm going to talk about coastal runoff, ocean upwelling, and lake turnover. All right, so coastal runoff, this is the easiest one. So water is basically rushing down mountains and streams, and as it gets closer and closer to the ocean, the streams get wider and slower. And when that happens, the nutrients will, as the water is moving more slowly, the nutrients can gather and sink and collect at the bottom as debris. And then if you've ever been to an estuary, this is, you can see here, the area where the freshwater... Dog, are you yelling?
Yes, I am.
Could you not?
We'll see.
All right. So you end up with lots of nutrients over here because they've kind of washed down from the river. Estuaries also have lots and lots of sunlight. So estuaries have both nutrients and sunlight, so that makes them some of the most productive environments on Earth. All right, so nutrients that have fallen into the benthic regions, this is what's going on in the ocean upwelling. Okay, so you have all this stuff on the surface, and then it dies and it falls to the bottom. Okay. You have wind that blows alongside the, kind of along the shoreline like this. And so the wind is going this way, and as it does that, it kind of is creating like a hole, right? As the water gets blown this way with the wind, and then the nutrients on the bottom can upwell, and the water will kind of churn up to fill this hole. And so then some of the surface water will go out this way. So you end up with this kind of constant pattern of movement. The wind is kind of pushing stuff this way, which creates a kind of a bit of a hole here, which is filled up with water upwelling from the bottom. Okay. All right, oh, here we go. Winds blow. Along the coast of Peru, the prevailing winds blow north, so the water's moving at the surface, and then the surface water moves, and the Earth's rotating, and the moving surface water is forced offshore, right? So this is also creating a kind of a hole here that needs to be filled. And then the surface water, as this leaves this area, then there's kind of a gap that gets replaced with the nutrient-laden water that's coming up from the bottom. All right, so that's ocean upwelling. So that's another way that you get nutrients to the surface. Next, we're going to talk about lake turnover. And you may not have heard of lake turnover before, but it is happening all around us in all of the little lakes around Ohio, especially this time of year.
Lake turnover sounds delicious!
Like delicious?
Yeah, like an apple turnover, but I love lake flavor.
That sounds pretty gross to me. But maybe I should ask you, at what temperature do you think water is the densest?
I think it must be the densest when it's ice because that's when it hurts the most to jump in.
Well, that's actually not the case. Water is actually, the molecules are the farthest apart when they are ice, right? Forming ice crystals. When water is warm, the water molecules tend to be relatively far apart because they are kind of excited and the warm water is kind of expanding. So so water is at its most dense when it is very, very cold, okay? And actually the coldest, the densest water is when water is at 4 degrees Celsius. So that is when water is at its most dense. All right, so let's look at this lake here. So in winter, the water near the surface is cold, although it's very high in oxygen because it just gets oxygen through the surface. Let's say it has ice on the top, so it's 0 degrees Celsius on the top. And then the 2 degrees Celsius water is a little bit heavier, so it sinks down a little bit. And then the 4 degrees Celsius water is the heaviest, so it's all sunk down at the bottom. Okay? So if you go to the bottom of the lake, you'll find lots of 4 degrees Celsius water, along with where all the high nutrient kind of material has been sitting. All right. In the spring, the surface of the lake will melt, right? So it'll go from 0 degrees to 2 degrees to 4 degrees, right? So now it's 4 degrees Celsius. Now this water is denser than the water below it, and it'll start to sink. It'll sink down to the bottom. It'll also take some of the oxygen from the high oxygen concentration area down. And when it goes down, it will displace the water that's down here. This water has lots of nutrients in it, and that will move up to the surface. And so nutrients are moved to the top, and oxygen is moved to the bottom. Okay, next you have what's called summer stratification. And so it's very cold at the bottom. It's quite warm at the top, right? Lots of oxygen at the top, lots of nutrients at the bottom. So that happens again. And then you have a fall turnover, where it gets colder and colder, and then as the water temperature on the surface gets colder and colder and it gets down to 4 degrees, that water will sink, bringing oxygen with it, and then moving the nutrients back up. All right, so these are the two cycles of turnover that you have that churn all of the nutrients from the bottom up and all the oxygen from the surface down. And if we didn't have these spring and fall turnovers, then you'd end up with most of the freshwater nutrients on the bottom of the lakes and all the oxygen at the top. And so these aquatic ecosystems would be much less productive than they are. All right, we have a reporter from the Lake Channel with some questions for you.
I am Kermit the Frog. In the winter, where can the most dense water be found? Wait, who's that?
That was just me doing a Kermit the Frog voice.
Stop, it's creepy.
Okay, I'll stop. But you have to answer his question. In the winter, where can the most dense water be found?
At the bottom.
Yeah, at the bottom. In the winter, where's the water warmest?
At the top.
Yeah, at the top. So in the spring, why does the surface water sink?
It's because it heats up from like 0 degrees to 4 degrees, and when it gets to 4 degrees, it's heavy and goes down.
Yeah. In the spring, what causes the nutrients to come to the surface?
They're getting out of the way of the nutrients that are coming down.
Yeah, that's right. All right, now we're going to do a quick run through of the major aquatic biomes. So the first one is lakes and ponds. So you know a lake and a pond when you see one. You tend to find them at high latitudes, and lakes and ponds are formed by glaciers. Okay. So glaciers, kind of made an indentation in the ground as they went through, and it filled with water, and that's a lake or a pond. You tend to get water movement and seasonal turnover in lakes and ponds, which are driven by the forces that we just talked about, wind and changes in temperature. And you have organisms within lakes and ponds that are adapted for specific zones. So some of them do better when there's lots of sun. Some of them are adapted to being on the bottom. All right, the next aquatic biome are the freshwater wetlands. So these are shallow water habitats where the soil is saturated with water for at least part of the year. And the way that you can tell the difference between a wetland and a lake and a pond is because wetlands only have shallow water, and they have actually plants that can grow up from the bottom, and break through the surface of the water. So you don't find those in lakes and ponds, only in wetlands. There are two types of wetlands, bogs and freshwater marshes and swamps. So a bog tends to have little or no water flow, and it's very oxygen and nutrient poor. So you tend to find lots and lots of peat moss and other well-adapted plants that can live in places where there's very little oxygen or nutrient. In a freshwater marsh or swamp, you tend to have more water flow and more nutrients, and they're more productive. Some marshes that you've probably seen around Ohio have, grasses and reeds growing through them, like cattails and things like that. And swamps, we tend to say, are dominated by trees and shrubs. So a swamp, you kind of imagine kind of a, Florida Everglades swamp where you have lots of overhanging trees and shrubs, right? Versus a marsh, which the main life forms tend to be grasses and reeds. All right, next we have streams. So they are moving constantly in one direction. So a creek is a small stream, a river is a large stream. So they're just different flavors of streams. Streams are not so deep that sunlight can't reach the bottom, and so usually light-reaching organisms is not a problem at all, except if a stream happens to be very deep or very turbid. And you find differences in the stream along its length. So at the beginning of the stream, it tends to have cold water and be very narrow and fast, and then at the end, maybe where it opens up into, some kind of an estuary, it tends to be warm, wide, and slow. And so if you look from the origin of a stream to the end of the stream, the origin tends to have relatively few organisms, but by the time you get to the end of the stream, it has many more different kinds of organisms. All right, next, estuaries. So an estuary, as we mentioned before, happens where a river meets an ocean and freshwater mixes with saltwater. And so you have these saline wetlands, right? So salty wetlands with open brackish waters. They tend to be relatively shallow, but some variation in depth. You end up with water flow fluctuating daily or seasonally. So daily because tides are coming in and out, and then seasonally because of things like storms and floods. And as water comes in and out, that affects the salinity and turbidity and the amount of nutrients that you can find in the estuary. So there's a lot of nutrients there. And as I mentioned before, estuaries are among the most productive environments on Earth. They are places where little fish are often, kind of hatched before they go out to sea. They can hold all sorts of vegetation, invertebrates, and plankton as well. All right, and then finally we have the oceans. So the water movement in the ocean is going to be dominated by different processes at different depths. So we already talked about the different zones of the ocean. So you have different things happening in different zones. You tend to find the most productivity in the intertidal and the neritic zones, less productivity in the deep water. And in the intertidal zone, you tend to have the most effects of tidal and wave action. In the neritic zone, the nutrients tend to come in from upwelling currents instead. And oceans also have, remember we talked about ocean gyres, right? So there's also large-scale currents that circulate water over large areas. And if you look at each of the zones that we talked about in the ocean, there are different species that are adapted to live in each of those zones.
Oh, oceans!
Yeah.
Lakes and streams!
Wait, like lakes and streams?
Lakes and ponds!
Lakes and ponds.
Streams!
All right, so that's 3.
Oh man. Marshes and bogs!
Yeah, that's the same one, so we're missing one. Which one are we missing?
Estuaries!
Yeah, estuaries. All right, we got all 5. All right, let's match them up. So which one of these is a stream?
Move constantly in one direction, like creeks and rivers.
Yep. What's an estuary?
Oh yeah, that's where the river meets the ocean and fresh water mixes with salt water.
Okay, lakes and ponds.
That's formed by glaciers at high latitudes.
Yep. What about oceans?
That's a vast continuous body of salt water.
Okay. Freshwater wetlands.
That's the shallow water habitats that include the bogs and the marshes.
Okay. All right, so we are constantly doing things that affect aquatic biomes. So we will fill or drain wetlands and ponds for different reasons. We will dam streams. We will create new aquatic anthromes. So an anthrome is like an anthropogenic biome. So a reservoir, for example, is a man-made kind of a biome that we've created. We transport invasive species like zebra mussels from one place to another. That affects the ecosystem in the places. We will do things like overexploit fisheries, and so that causes cascading food web effects. So maybe we eat all the fish, and then that causes other bad things to happen. We will sometimes dispose of debris in aquatic biomes, either on purpose or unintentionally, and that can clog up the creek and put trash into the oceans. We release chemicals, either accidentally or intentionally, into aquatic habitats. And so we know that global climate change causes the acidification of the ocean, which negatively affects a bunch of different species. All right, so hopefully you learned about the different levels of ecological study, what determines distribution and abundance of organisms, including biotic and abiotic factors, which interact to form global climate patterns, influencing both terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes.